From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
My judicial philosophy is straightforward. A judge must be independent and must interpret the law, not make the law. A judge must interpret statutes as written, and a judge must interpret the Constitution as written, informed by history and tradition and precedent.
Confirmation hearings begin today for Judge Brett Kavanaugh, President Trump's pick to fill Justice Anthony Kennedy's seat on the Supreme Court, even as the White House refuses to release more than 100,000 pages of documents about his time in the Bush White House. If he's confirmed, it would likely make the Supreme Court the most conservative since the 1930s. We'll get response from Kristen Clark of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, which released a damning report about Kavanaugh's record on cases including abortion rights. She'll attend the Senate confirmation hearings for Kavanaugh this week. Then, in a major victory for Indigenous groups and environmentalists, Canada's Federal Court of Appeals has rejected the government's approval to triple the capacity of the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain pipeline.
We're winning. The spirit of the people that I feel behind me was too big for Kinder Morgan.
We'll go to Canada to get response to the ruling from Ariel Deranger with Indigenous Climate Action and a member of the Athabascan Chippewa First Nation, and to Mexico City to speak with Winona LaDuke, Native American activist with Honor the Earth. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Confirmation hearings begin today for President Trump's pick to fill Justice Anthony Kennedy's seat as the Supreme Court swing vote. If Judge Brett Kavanaugh is confirmed, it would create a block of 5 justices that would likely make the Supreme Court the most conservative since the 1930s. Critics warn his confirmation could lead to major rollbacks of civil rights, environmental regulations, gun control measures, voting rights and reproductive rights, including possibly overturning Roe v. Wade. Just hours before the hearings were set to begin, a lawyer for former President George W. Bush released more than 40,000 pages of documents from Kavanaugh's time in the White House counsel's office from 2001 to 2003. He was also staff secretary from 2003 to 2006 before Bush appointed him to the U.S. Court of Appeals of D.C. Yet the Trump administration's withholding more than 100,000 pages of Kavanaugh's records on the basis of presidential privilege. We'll have more on Judge Kavanaugh's confirmation hearings after headlines. President Trump has attacked Attorney General Jeff Sessions again after the Justice Department filed charges against Republican Congress members Christopher Collins of New York and Republican Congressmember Duncan Hunter of California. Collins is accused of insider trading. Hunter's accused of illegally using campaign funds for personal expenses. The 2 Republicans were the first and second members of Congress to endorse candidate Donald Trump in 2016. Jeff Sessions, as senator, was the third. On Monday, Trump tweeted, quote, 2 long-running Obama-era investigations of 2 very popular Republican congressmen were brought to a well-publicized charge just ahead of the midterms by Jeff Sessions' Justice Department. 2 easy wins now in doubt because there is not enough time. Good job, Jeff, the president tweeted. In response, Republican Senator Ben Sasse of Nebraska said, quote, the United States is not some banana republic with a 2-tiered system of justice, one for the majority party and one for the minority party, rebuking the president of the United States of his same party. In Iowa, the father of murdered college student Molly Tibbetts is demanding the Trumps, politicians, and white supremacists stop appropriating his daughter's death to promote hate against immigrants. Authorities have charged an undocumented farm worker from Mexico with first-degree murder for Molly's death. In an article in the Des Moines Register, Rob Tibbetts wrote, "Do not appropriate Molly's soul in advancing views she believed were profoundly racist. The act grievously extends the crime that stole Molly from our family." the person who's accused of taking Mali's life is no more a reflection of the Hispanic community as white supremacists are of all white people, Mali's father wrote in his op-ed piece. Tibbet's column comes only a day after the Des Moines Register published a column by President Trump's eldest son, Donald Trump Jr., in which he blamed Democrats for Tibbet's death. In Syria, government forces are preparing for an imminent offensive against the northwestern province of Idlib, the Syrian opposition's last major territory in Syria. 3 million people currently live in Idlib. On Monday, President Trump threatened Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad, tweeting, quote, President Bashar al-Assad of Syria must not recklessly attack Idlib province. The Russians and Iranians would be making a grave humanitarian mistake to take part in this potential human tragedy. Hundreds of thousands of people could be killed. Don't let that happen, the president tweeted. Hours later, Russia reportedly launched airstrikes against Idlib. A Burmese court sentenced 2 Reuters journalists to 7 years in prison for violating Burma's colonial-era Official Secrets Act. At the time of their arrest, Jaw So-u and Walon were investigating a massacre committed by the Burmese military targeting Rohingya Muslims in the village of Indin nearly a year ago. Human rights and press freedom groups have called for the journalists to be freed. This is UN Human Rights Chief and former Chilean President Michelle Bachelet.
I was shocked today in the morning when I woke up and I learned that these 2 journalists from Reuters have been imposed a sentence of 7 years of jail. I think the information they gave on the massacre was of public interest, and I think also that all the process, the trial, was a travesty of justice. So I will urge the Myanmar government to release them as soon as possible, immediately.
In Yemen, the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition has admitted its airstrike on a school bus that killed 51 people, 41 school children, was unjustified. The bomb that killed the school children August 9th in Yemen's northern city of Sada was made by U.S. weapons manufacturer Lockheed Martin and sold by the United States to Saudi Arabia. In Germany, more than 50,000 people gathered Monday for an anti-racism concert in Chemnitz, where 1 week earlier a deadly stabbing of a German man led to violent xenophobic neo-Nazi protests. An Iraqi and a Syrian were arrested in connection with the killing. This is resident Andrea Ulrich speaking at the anti-racism concert.
Absolut genial.
This is absolutely fantastic because as the people of Chemnitz, we have to show that our city is colorful, open to everyone, and that we have no sympathy for what has happened here in recent days.
In Brazil, a massive fire at the National Museum has destroyed millions of pieces of art and history. The 200-year-old museum is Brazil's oldest historical institution, one of the most important in Latin America. Museum officials say the damage is irreparable. In a major victory for Indigenous groups and environmentalists, Canada's Federal Court of Appeals has rejected the government's approval to triple the capacity of the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline. On Thursday, Justice Eleanor Dawson nullified licensing for the $7.4 billion project and brought construction to a halt. Her ruling cited inadequate consultations with Indigenous peoples affected by the project. Just minutes after the court's decision, Kinder Morgan shareholders agreed to sell the existing pipeline and the expansion project to the federal government for $4.5 billion. We'll have more on the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline later in the broadcast. Meanwhile, a coalition of environmental and civil liberties groups are launching a new campaign called Protect the Protest to fight back against lawsuits aimed at limiting free speech. Corporations often use so-called SLAPP suits, or strategic lawsuits against public participation, SLAPP, to try to silence activists. Rallies launching the campaign are planned for today and tomorrow in New York City, San Francisco, and Dallas. The company that built the controversial Dakota Access Pipeline, Energy Transfer Partners, is based in Dallas. Energy Transfer Partners has sued Greenpeace, Earth First, and BankTrack, among others, for up to $1 billion for undermining the project. Tropical Storm Gordon is slated to hit the Gulf Coast of the United States as a hurricane later today, with parts of the Gulf Coast expected to receive up to 8 inches of rain between today and Thursday. The National Hurricane Center also issued a storm surge warning for parts of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. In Florida, gubernatorial candidate Andrew Gillum is speaking out after he was targeted by a racist robocall paid for by a white supremacist group. Gillum is aiming to be Florida's first black governor. This is a clip of the robocall, a warning it's extremely racist.
Well, hello there. I is Andrew Gillum, and I'll be the mayor of Tallahassee.
This is gubernatorial candidate Andrew Gillum responding to the racist robocalls in an interview with CNN.
And make sure that we don't racialize and, frankly, weaponize race as a part of this process, which is why I've called on my opponent to really work to rise above some of these things. People are taking their cues from him, from his campaign, and from Donald Trump. And we saw in Charlottesville that can lead to real, frankly, dangerous outcomes.
And I also in sports news, Nike has chosen former San Francisco's 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick to be the face of its Just Do It campaign. In 2016, Kaepernick began protesting police brutality and racism by taking a knee during the anthem before NFL games, sparking ongoing league-wide protests. Kaepernick was not re-signed to the 49ers after the 2016 season, what's widely seen as retaliation for his activism, nor signed by any other team. On Monday, he posted an image from the Nike campaign, which reads, quote, "Believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything. Just do it." The New Yorker magazine editor, David Remnick, says President Trump's former chief strategist, Steve Bannon, will no longer be headlining the upcoming New Yorker Festival in October after a slew of celebrities and New Yorker staff members protested Bannon's participation. Steve Bannon was the longtime head of the far right-wing news outlet Breitbart News, which frequently publishes white nationalist propaganda, and became a top advisor to President Trump. In New York City, the award-winning newspaper The Village Voice is shutting down after 63 years. Founded in 1955 by Dan Wolfe, Ed Fancher, and Norman Mailer, the left-leaning paper was the first alternative weekly in the United States. Last year, it stopped its print publication. Friday, publisher Peter Barbie said he's shutting down the influential newspaper entirely. In recent days, the nation paid tribute to the legendary singer Aretha Franklin and Senator John McCain. On Saturday, former Presidents Barack Obama and George W. Bush gave eulogies to McCain at his funeral at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. President Trump was not invited and spent the day golfing. Speakers at Aretha Franklin's funeral in Detroit included former President Bill Clinton, Jesse Jackson, the Reverend Al Sharpton, who hailed Aretha Franklin as the soundtrack to the civil rights movement, and Georgetown sociologist Michael Eric Dyson.
And then this orange apparition had the nerve to say she worked for him. You lugubrious leech. You doppelganger of deceit and deviance. You lethal liar, you dim-witted dictator, you foolish fascist. She ain't worked for you. She worked above you. She worked beyond you. Get your preposition right.
And legendary pianist and composer Randy Weston has died at the age of 92 at his home in Brooklyn, New York. For more than 6 decades, Randy Weston was a pioneering jazz musician incorporating the vast rhythmic heritage of Africa. His 1960 album, Uhuru Africa, was a landmark recording that celebrated the independence movements in Africa and the influence of traditional African music on jazz. In 2001, he was named Jazz Master by the National Endowment for the Arts, considered to be the nation's highest honor in jazz. In 2012, the late Randy Weston appeared on Democracy Now! And talked about the making of Uhuru Africa, which featured lyrics and liner notes by Langston Hughes.
So I wanted to create a work of music celebrating this freedom of Africa. So Langston wrote a freedom poem for me, and also he wrote the words, a song I call African Lady. That song was dedicated to our mothers, our sisters, those African women who were always in the background, who always supported us, you see. And then finally we
Can you play a little?
Oh, yeah. You mean which one? African lady? Sure.
To see the full hour with Randy Weston down at Borough of Manhattan Community College that we did as he played and spoke, you can go to democracynow.org. Randy Weston died on Saturday at the age of 92. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. Confirmation hearings begin today for Judge Brett Kavanaugh, President Trump's pick to fill Justice Anthony Kennedy's seat on the Supreme Court. If he is confirmed, it would likely make the court the most conservative since the 1930s. Kavanaugh is 53 years old and could serve on the Supreme Court for decades. Critics warn his confirmation would lead to major rollbacks of civil rights, labor protections, environmental regulations, gun control measures, voting rights, and reproductive rights, including possibly the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Just hours before the hearings were set to begin, a lawyer for former President George W. Bush released more than 40,000 pages of documents from Kavanaugh's time in the White House counsel's office between 2001 and 2003. He was also staff secretary in the White House from 2003 to 2006 before Bush appointed him to the U.S. Court of Appeals of the District of Columbia. Senate Minority Leader Charles Schumer tweeted Monday, quote, "Not a single senator will be able to review these records before tomorrow," and he called for the hearings to be delayed. This comes as the Trump administration is withholding more than 100,000 pages of Kavanaugh's records on the basis of presidential privilege. On Sunday, Senate Judiciary Committee member Dick Durbin joined in calls to delay the hearings.
The assertion of executive privilege by the White House to take 100,000 documents and say the American people will not get a chance to see them as they reflect on Kavanaugh's background is the first time in history. This denial of access to documents violates a rule that we thought was the tradition of the Senate under Senator Sessions and Senator Leahy, time and again when it came to Obama nominees. They are suppressing these documents. If we're lucky, we will see 6% of all of the documents that have been produced or could be produced to reflect on Kavanaugh's true position on issues.
Today's hearings will begin with opening statements and introductions from witnesses, including former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. Democrats will call former President Richard Nixon's White House counsel John Dean as a witness to testify about the limits of executive power. After the hearings, the full Senate will vote on the committee's recommendation on Kavanaugh's nomination. Last year, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell used the so-called nuclear option to confirm Trump's other Supreme Court nominee, Neil Gorsuch, with just 51 votes instead of 60. Meanwhile, conservative groups like the National Rifle Association are spending millions on TV ads in states from Maine to Alaska, where key senators' votes on Kavanaugh's confirmation are at stake. For more, we go to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Kristen Clark, President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, which also leads the Nonpartisan Election Protection Coalition. Last week, they released a damning report on Kavanaugh's record on cases and also issued a statement opposing Kavanaugh's nomination to the Supreme Court. Kristen Clark will attend the Senate confirmations for Kavanaugh all this week. They start today. Kristen Clark, welcome back to Democracy Now! Can you talk about what is known at this point? 100,000 documents the Trump administration is still holding, and yet you've done a comprehensive look at Brett Kavanaugh's record to the extent that you can. Talk about your concerns.
So this is a most extraordinary position. Securing a lifetime seat on our nation's highest court really requires that both the Senate and public exercise the highest level of vigilance in understanding who Brett Kavanaugh is and understanding his record both on and off the court. My organization, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, undertook the review that we were able to. We looked at his cases during his time on the D.C. Circuit, We looked at his cases in the areas of criminal justice, voting rights, environmental justice, economic justice, and more. And we came to the very solid conclusion that he is somebody who will turn the clock back when it comes to advancing civil rights and protecting constitutional rights in our country. Let me give one very powerful example that I think illustrates his judicial philosophy and the kind of judge that he would likely be if confirmed to the court. In an incredibly important case called Homer versus EPA, Brett Kavanaugh struck down a critical rule passed by the EPA to deal with cross-state air pollution. It was called the Cross-State Air Pollution Rule. That case went up to the Supreme Court, and he was reversed. Brett Kavanaugh was reversed by a margin of 6-2, with both Justice Roberts and Kennedy in the majority. The late Justice Scalia and Justice Clarence Thomas were in the dissent in that case, but it shows that he is somebody who squarely aligns with Justice Thomas when it comes to judicial philosophy. It shows that he is somebody who puts the interests of industry over people, the industry of the powerful over the minority. He is somebody who would gut and undercut the important work that our federal agencies are undertaking right now to protect the American public when it comes to environmental racism. He is somebody who would absolutely shift the court to the right. Justice Kennedy was by no means a progressive on the court, but his vote was in play. And in fact, in about 50 cases concerning civil rights matters, he and Roberts were on opposite ends of the spectrum. With Brett Kavanaugh, we can expect that 100% of the time we'll likely have 5 conservative justices who are turning the clock back on incredibly important areas for minority communities in our country.
Well, Kristen Clark, before we get more deeply into his actual record, this whole issue of the documents and the Trump administration not wanting to release 100,000 documents from his time as a staffer in the White House, in the Bush White House. I want to turn to then Senator Jeff Sessions, speaking in 2010 when he was the senior Republican on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and the same issue arose back then. He warned he would not allow confirmation hearings to go forward for President Obama's Supreme Court nominee Elena Kagan until the release of 160,000 pages of documents related to Kagan's days in the Clinton White House as Solicitor General were released.
We're heading to what could be a train wreck. I don't believe that this committee can go forward with an adequate hearing when the public record of a nominee of this importance to such a lifetime position as justice on the Supreme Court, it can go forward without these documents in question. So
that was Jeff Sessions in 2010, and all of those documents were released by the Obama administration. Kristen Clark, your take on this?
This is total hypocrisy. There is a double standard in place. In the modern era, the Senate has insisted that we have full transparency when it comes to evaluating the records underlying Supreme Court nominees. And as you heard, Jeff Sessions, then Senator, threatened to boycott Ms. Kagan's nomination. And ultimately, every single document from Kagan's tenure in the White House was turned over. There's a gross double standard in place today. In just an hour or so, the Senate will open hearings on Brett Kavanaugh, despite the fact that millions of documents from his time in the White House, where he worked in both the White House counsel's office and as secretary, working shoulder to shoulder with President Bush, none of these materials have been turned over. Chairman Grassley made the inexplicable decision to only seek documents pertaining to his time in the White House counsel's office. And on Friday night, we saw a memo come out from a private lawyer who has been retained to review and screen those documents, saying that they weren't turning 100,000 of those documents over because of executive privilege. As far as we know, this is the first time a president or a White House has ever invoked executive privilege in this era, in this way. And we have to remember this is the Trump White House invoking the privilege for documents from the Bush era, from a period that predates him by over a decade. Bush himself has said, I authorize these documents to be disclosed. I want this review process to be guided by the principle of transparency. But as we've seen throughout the Trump administration, their rule is to operate in secrecy and to keep information away from the American public. It is shameful, frankly, that the Senate is moving forward with this confirmation process today. They should suspend those hearings until they have all of those materials and can do their proper due diligence. I am still waiting for a senator, frankly, who's courageous enough to file suit and seek judicial relief because, frankly, we're in uncharted territory. We have never seen in a modern era a process that has been so shrouded in secrecy as this one. And it's important that we ask, what are they hiding in those materials? You know, Brett Kavanaugh, one of the critical roles that he played in the White House was reviewing and vetting judicial nominees. Perhaps we'll see materials where he explicitly asked whether a nominee would overturn Roe v. Wade, whether a nominee believed that discrimination was real and ongoing in our country. Perhaps there are red flag indicators that would tell us precisely who Brett Kavanaugh truly is and what his judicial outlook is. I think the White House is fearful of this, and it's why they have gone through extraordinary steps to hide this information from the American public.
This was all as he was staff secretary for George W. Bush from 2003 to 6. Following up on this, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer tweeted last week, Senator Grassley now admitting the Senate will only receive half the documents he requested, 900,000, before the hearing starts. That means senators will have seen only 6% of Kavanaugh's records and the public will have seen 3%, Schumer said. He continued in a second tweet, further, these documents aren't the official National Archives curation of White House docs, but the ones that have been pre-screened by Kavanaugh's former deputy and George Bush's private lawyer. The Senate will likely have zero records from the archives in time for the hearing. And the New York Times reported that, in fact, Mitch McConnell said when the possibility of another Supreme Court pick on the part of Trump, do not go with Brett Kavanaugh because of his long paper trail, Kristen Clark.
Well, you know, let me just take a moment to talk about his record on affirmative action. You know, there are two incredibly important cases that are moving through the courts right now, a challenge to affirmative action efforts at Harvard and the University of North Carolina. And my organization has been involved in both of those cases for the past 3 years, where we are defending a diverse group of students who believe that racial diversity on college campuses today is important. And we are standing by the ongoing efforts of higher educational institutions that are working to promote diversity on campus. And Brett Kavanaugh has espoused very troubling views in this area. He is someone who espouses a colorblind outlook on the world. He's somebody who believes that America, there is only one race, which, of course, does not comport with the work that we do at my organization, where we see discrimination outright on the basis of race every day. It's important that we have access to these documents and materials so we can really understand who he is before we move forward with this confirmation process. And my hope is that when the Senate goes in today, they'll realize that this is a sham hearing, that they have the right to access all of those materials in the way that we have done for each and every nominee in the modern era. And, you know, I want to underscore one point, because there are lots of big numbers being thrown around about the volume of materials that have been received to date. It's quality over quantity. Remarkably, about 42,000 duplicate copies of a Heritage Foundation flyer were turned over to the Senate. This was an event organized by Justice Thomas's wife in conjunction with the Heritage Foundation. And those 42,000 duplicate documents do nothing to aid the Senate in carrying out its important constitutional obligation of providing advice and consent when it comes to reviewing Supreme Court nominees. I hope that at the end of today, if it goes as awful as I expect it will, that they will move to suspend these hearings and give themselves the time they need to do proper due diligence on Brett Kavanaugh.
We're going to go to break and then come back. We want to talk about issues of labor and the pregnant immigrant young woman who Brett Kavanaugh tried to stop having an abortion despite a judge's ruling. In the end, she got the abortion that is legal in this country. This is Democracy Now! Kristen Clark is President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. We'll continue with her in a moment. By the late Randy Weston, the legendary pianist and composer, died Saturday at the age of 92 at his home in Brooklyn, New York. To see our full hour with him as we sat at the piano at the Tribeca Performing Arts Center, go to democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, confirmation hearings begin today for Judge Brett Kavanaugh, President Trump's pick to fill Justice Anthony Kennedy's seat on the Supreme Court.
And we're getting response from Kristen Clark of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, who released a damning report on Kavanaugh's record on a number of different cases. Juan?
Kristen Clark, I'd like to ask you about an aspect of Kavanaugh's record that really hasn't gotten much attention. His record when it comes to working people and labor. Yesterday on Labor Day, Hillary Clinton tweeted out, "Happy Labor Day. There's no better time to talk about why workers' rights would suffer if Brett Kavanaugh, whose hearing for a lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court starts tomorrow, is confirmed." And Hillary Clinton pointed to a few cases, AFL-CIO versus Gates, where he was involved in, and also a case of Verizon, 2010 case, Verizon New England versus the NLRB, where Kavanaugh wrote the majority opinion in that case for the D.C. Circuit Court, basically saying that Verizon workers had no right to post pro-union signs on their cars if the cars were parked in a Verizon lot while they were working.
There's also a case involving a woman who was killed tragically in an accident at SeaWorld. And in that case, OSHA, the agency that imposes safety regulations on employers, found a basis and cause for essentially finding that SeaWorld did not do enough to make known the hazards tied with this work. And Kavanaugh, again, is somebody who puts the interests of employers and industry over the interests of little people. The ruling in that case was not a favorable one, and it's consistent with all of the cases that we've seen in the economic justice context, which show a predisposition to side with employers over the interests of employees.
I want to ask you about the undocumented teenager who is at the center of the lawsuit with the Trump administration over her right to have an abortion, and specifically the role of Judge Kavanaugh. The 17-year-old was detained in a refugee resettlement shelter in Texas and only had the abortion after a U.S. appeals court ruled in her favor. She was referred to in court documents as Jane Doe. In an interview with HBO's Vice News, Jane Doe described deciding to have an abortion.
When I first arrived at the shelter, I decided to do it because I don't feel capable of being a mature woman or being strong or old enough to be able to take care of it. And I don't feel sure about having a child.
So that was Jane Doe. Last year, Democracy Now! Spoke to one of her lawyers, Jennifer Dalvin, director of the ACLU's Reproductive Freedom Project, about her case.
She went to that Texas court and she got judicial permission to get an abortion. But since then, every step of the way, the Trump administration has stood to block her from exercising her decision. Instead of taking her to her appointments, what they've done is taken her to a religious crisis pregnancy center where folks tried to stop her, convince her not to have an abortion, force her to look at sonograms, and they would not let her go to her procedure. For a month now, they were trying to stop her from getting the procedure she wanted.
Well, in 2017, while on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, Judge Kavanaugh halted a district court order that would have allowed Jane Doe to get her abortion while in federal custody. When his decision was reversed, Judge Kavanaugh wrote a dissent that argued the decision was, quote, ultimately based on a constitutional principle as novel as it is wrong, a new right for unlawful immigrant minors in U.S. government detention to obtain immediate abortion on demand. He went on to write, quote, the government has permissible interests in favoring fetal life and refraining from facilitating abortion. Kristen Clark of Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. I mean, this addresses a number of issues, but two major ones. The rights of immigrants in this country. Ultimately, she got this abortion. And also this key issue of his stand on abortion. Will he overturn Roe v. Wade?
So let's put this in context. President Trump has said over and over again that his goal that he intends to put judges on the court who will overturn Roe v. Wade. That was his solemn vow. And with Judge Kavanaugh, Brett Kavanaugh, we see a number of indicators which suggest that he is poised to carry out President Trump's agenda. This case involving the undocumented teen was a remarkable one. We see Brett Kavanaugh making taking every step possible to make it harder for this young girl to get access to an abortion while a clock is ticking away. At some point, it would have been impossible for her to exercise her choice to have an abortion. The full D.C. Circuit came behind Brett Kavanaugh, intervened and provided relief for that minor. So she was ultimately able to go and have the abortion, and observed a few things. Observed that Brett Kavanaugh never stayed the hearing to allow the woman to explore other options. Observed that Brett Kavanaugh kept asking kind of repetitive questions, almost to allow the clock to continue running. I mean, it was clear that Brett Kavanaugh really was obstructing this minor's effort and desire to get an abortion. But let's also look at his speech. His speeches. I mean, he is somebody who lifts up and celebrates the late Justice Rehnquist, who was in the dissent in Roe. And he also has another case where he essentially allowed an employer to use religion as a basis to deny employees access to contraceptive care. There are a number of cases in the courts right now that are making their way up to the Supreme Court that seek to chip away at Roe's promise. And I firmly believe that all of the evidence in Brett Kavanaugh's record make clear that he is somebody who will gut Roe if the question comes before the court. Again, he is not somebody who is prepared to uphold the court's precedent in this area. And this could have dangerous implications for women, but most especially for women of color and low-income women in our country who really are the ones who face the greatest barriers when it comes to accessing reproductive health services, in our country.
And, of course, President Trump famously declared repeatedly during his campaign that he would only appoint anti-abortion justices to the Supreme Court. He was questioned about his views on abortion by moderator Chris Wallace.
But what I'm asking you, sir, is do you want to see the court overturn? You just said you want to see the court protect the Second Amendment. Do you want to see the court overturn Roe v. Wade?
Well, if we put another 2 or perhaps 3 justices on, that's really what's going to be. That will happen, and that'll happen automatically, in my opinion, because I am putting pro-life justices on the court. I will say this: it will go back to the states, and the states will then make a determination.
So that was President Trump, well, at the time, candidate Trump, being questioned by Fox's Chris Wallace in a debate with Hillary Clinton.
Kristen Clark, I wanted to ask you, going back to the discussion you started earlier about his racial policies. Back in 1999, Kavanaugh wrote an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal having to do with the situation in Hawaii. This was during the Clinton administration, and there was an Office of Hawaiian Affairs and the Clinton administration that were trying to redress the theft of the land of the native Hawaiians when the Hawaiian kingdom was annexed. And Kavanaugh called this system of redress by the Office of Hawaiian Affairs a, quote, naked racial spoils system, and he lamented that, quote, any racial group with creative reasoning could qualify as an Indian tribe, and basically seeking to erase the entire history of Hawaii's relationship to the United States. I'm wondering what you think of this.
Yeah, this is a very important piece of Kavanaugh's record that I hope gets proper attention. He is somebody who certainly didn't sympathize with the struggles of indigenous populations in Hawaii who were seeking political autonomy, who were seeking political power because they are so marginalized. But more importantly, his views expressed in an amicus brief that he filed in that case and in a subsequent Wall Street Journal article make clear that he is somebody who subscribes to a colorblind outlook of the world, which is just not a realistic perspective for any judge to have in our country today, a country where we have civil rights laws on the book and where we have parts of our Constitution that recognize that discrimination is something that we're struggling with and something that we need tools to fight. I'll note that he filed an amicus brief in that case you describe on behalf of an organization called the Center for Equal Opportunity. This is a think tank organization that has as part of its mission tearing down affirmative action. There are strong indicators in Kavanaugh's record that he is somebody who doesn't see race. He's somebody who has chosen a colorblind outlook, and he is somebody who would likely not adhere to the Supreme Court's precedent in cases like Fisher that recognize that schools, that colleges and universities in our country have grounds and the right to use race as one among a number of factors when pulling together their student bodies, that he is not somebody who sees that racial diversity in our country as something that is valuable, important, and worth fighting for. I hope that we'll see the Senate really ask hard and probing questions that make clear Brett Kavanaugh's dangerous views when it comes to race and the recognition of racial discrimination in our country today.
Kristen Clark, we want to thank you for being with us. We're going to cover these hearings all week. They begin today. Kristen Clark, President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, which also leads the Nonpartisan Election Protection Coalition. We will link to this report you released on Brett Kavanaugh's record on cases concerning civil rights, criminal justice, voting rights, fair housing, education, reproductive rights, environmental justice, and access to justice. And also, the group issued a statement opposing Judge Kavanaugh's nomination to the Supreme Court. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, a major decision around the Trans Mountain Pipeline and oil politics on this continent. Stay with us. The Healers by the late Randy Weston. He performed the song when he spoke with Democracy Now! In 2012. He died this weekend at his home in Brooklyn, New York. To see the hour interview with the great pianist, you can go to democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, in a major victory for Indigenous groups and environmentalists, Canada's Federal Court of Appeals has rejected the government's approval to triple the capacity of the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline. On Thursday, Justice Eleanor Dawson nullified licensing for the $7.4 billion project and brought construction to a halt until the National Energy Board and the federal government complete court-ordered fixes. Her ruling cited inadequate consultations with Indigenous peoples affected by the project and found the National Energy Board's assessment of the expansion was so flawed that the federal cabinet should not have relied on it during the approval process. It said the report failed to address the impact the project could have on the marine environment near a shipping terminal at the end of the expanded line, or the impact of a 7-fold increase in tanker traffic on endangered killer whales in the area. Hours after the court decision, Indigenous groups celebrated the ruling. This is to Tsleil-Waututh Chief Reuben George responding to the court decision Thursday.
We're winning. At the beginning, I remember people saying this is a David and Goliath fight. And it's true. The spirit of the people that I feel behind me was too big for Kinder Morgan. Was too big.
In an interesting twist, just minutes after the court's decision, Kinder Morgan shareholders agreed to sell the existing pipeline and the expansion project to the federal government for $4.5 billion. Prime Minister Trudeau had announced in May that Canada would purchase the pipeline. This means the government now owns the project as its expansion faces years of further review. Canada's Finance Minister Bill Morneau responded to the developments Thursday.
We're absolutely committed to moving forward with this project. What the decision today asked us to do was to respond promptly, gave us some direction on how we could do that in a way that was going to be efficient from a time standpoint. So we will be considering our next steps in light of that. What we really saw today was a confirmation that our government's decision to buy this pipeline, because of political risks that were hard for a private sector actor, was absolutely the right conclusion.
Kinder Morgan has confirmed its work on the pipeline will now stop, saying in a statement, Trans Mountain is currently taking measures to suspend construction-related activities on the project in a safe and orderly manner, unquote. Well, all of this prompted Alberta's Premier, Rachel Notley, to announce Alberta's pulling out of Canada's federal climate plan.
Until the federal government gets its act together, Alberta is pulling out of the federal climate plan. And let's be clear. Without Alberta, that plan isn't worth the paper it's written on.
For more, we're joined by Winona LeDuc, Native American activist, executive director of the group Honor the Earth. She lives and works on the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota, but she is joining us from Mexico City. And joining us from Alberta, Canada, by phone is Ariel Dranger, founder and executive director of the group Indigenous Climate Action, a member of the Athabascan Chippewa First Nation. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Well, let's go north first to Ariel. Your response to the judge's decision and what this means for First Nations opposition to this pipeline.
Well, I think first off, we have to consider the fact that this isn't the first time that the federal court has ruled in favor of First Nations. In 2016, we saw that with respect to the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline, that it found that the previous administration had failed to adequately consult with First Nations. This is another case where consultation is flawed. We have to consider what this actually means. The consultation process in this country is fundamentally broken and doesn't actually uphold international standards that are outlined within the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And that is really the fundamental thing that we need to be achieving: free, prior, and informed consent. And we're not getting that through the consultation process. And we have to look at what we're doing wrong in this country and take actual measures to correct it. And that means giving communities the right to say no. And that's not happening here.
And I'd like to ask you, in terms of Prime Minister Trudeau, on the one hand, he claims that he is a leading fighter trying to halt climate change. On the other hand, he's continuing to pursue the exploitation of fossil fuels in Canada. You talk about his situation right now.
Yeah, this is exactly it. The fact of the matter is that we are not talking about moving the line towards taking aggressive steps to take action on climate change, but we're talking about building a giant constructed pipeline that will carry Alberta's bitumen, which is extracted from my people's territory, that increases global climate change by adding enormous amounts of emissions annually. And we're talking about a government that's doing whatever it takes to get this pipeline built so that we can continue to create emissions rather than decreasing emissions like the rest of the world.
You talk about what it means that the shareholders have just voted Trans Mountain, that, yes, the government can buy it for $4.5 billion. So that means you all own it now, and yet the judge has ruled against it moving forward.
Well, this is just it. We are out $4.5 billion in this country because of government's lack of ability to look at the fact that Indigenous rights actually hold weight. They hold their weight in this country. The court has continued to rule on our side that the government is failing to do this, and now we're out $4.5 million. I think that is the reason why Trudeau and the government is trying to save face by saying we're going to do whatever it takes to build it, because now they're on the hook for the $4.5 billion bill.
I'd like to bring in Winona LeDuc, director of the group Honor the Earth. Your reaction to the decision of the Canadian federal court?
Well, first, I want to say that Canada has a problem. I mean, they don't have a plan B for their economy. You have to remember that Canada is the tar sands producer, and they're trying to figure out how to milk the tar sands in the face of, everything is burning from California to the Arctic. The other thing is that, they are 75% of the world's mining corporations are Canadian. And so the Canadian economy is predicated on this still, let's just mine it, let's suck it out, let's ship it to someplace, Staples economy. So Canada needs an economic restructuring. That's what it needs in order for us to deal with some of the problems that we're facing, across the board. Now, of course, we are all really pleased with this because the fact is that these are illegal and immoral pipelines. What Ariel is talking about, the idea of free, prior, and informed consent. That's a UN standard. That's a United Nations standard for relations between state governments and Indigenous nations or First Nations. That's not being upheld by Canada, and that's certainly not being upheld by the United States. Canada's approach is pretty much gunboat diplomacy, as it is in the United States. We will starve you until you come to an agreement to host a pipeline or host a mine. That's how Canada operates. That's how the U.S. operates. But this court has said you're not going to do that. And in fact, you're going to have to get consent from these people. So it's a very, very important decision for all of us.
Winona LeDuc, you're in Mexico City right now, but you were arrested last week in Bemidji, Minnesota, as you were opposing the Enbridge Line 3 oil pipeline, the pipeline that would carry tar sands oil from Alberta, Canada, to a terminal in Superior, Wisconsin. In June, the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission approved that pipeline. Can you talk about why you were arrested and how that pipeline links to this Canadian decision?
Yeah, I mean, the state of Minnesota has had this long process. For 6 years, I've been facing down the barrel of the Enbridge pipelines. And every agency in the state of Minnesota and the administrative law judge, after reviewing 72,000 comments, of which 68,000 comments were opposing the pipeline, and as much additional written testimony, recommended against issuing a certificate of need and against issuing a permit for the route. In a rogue decision, unprecedented in Minnesota history, the Public Utilities Commission, 5 members said they felt like they had a gun to their head by Enbridge. The gun meaning that Enbridge would just let Line 3 collapse and break and leak all over northern Minnesota. Therefore, they felt they had to issue this permit. We all know that that's wrong. One, you should remove the gun because you're the regulatory agency, and you shouldn't buckle to a Canadian pipeline corporation that now wants a seventh pipeline across your territory. Yes, you are right. I got cited last week. We call it kind of like arrest light in downtown Bemidji with about 26 other people, mostly members of the Ojibwe Nation and church people, as well as the board chair of the Sierra Club for opposing this line. And what we're trying to point out also is that in the final days of the final negotiations on the pipeline, right in front of us at the Public Utilities Commission, one of the PUC commissioners turns to Enbridge and says, will you pay for the police required to put in this pipeline? In other words, will you finance the brutalization of Minnesotans in order to get your pipeline in, Enbridge? And Enbridge said yes. And so we have, a multi-agency task force out of Bemidji now that is preparing to launch, we saw an LRAD, long-range acoustic device, an MRAP heading up to northern Minnesota. We are seeing the beginning of policing. And so what we're pointing out is that thousands of people are going to get arrested in Minnesota if they proceed with a pipeline which is immoral and it is illegal and goes across our territory. I also want to say, Amy, you may remember that 2 years ago on this day is known as the Day of the Dogs. That is the day on Standing Rock when you were charged and the dogs were released on our people as the Energy Transfer Partners moved ahead and bulldozed sacred sites for the Dakota Access Pipeline. And I think that you also know that the Enbridge Corporation owns 28% of that Energy Transfer Partners pipeline, the Dakota Access Pipeline. And so we are fully aware of how brutal Enbridge can be. And that's why we stood there to get arrested, to say you should not do that to our people. It is wrong to do.
Ariel Deranger, I wanted to ask you about the debate among the peoples of the First Nations in Alberta in terms of the pipeline, because obviously the energy industry employs a lot of folks in that area. Your sense of how the debate is going on among the First Nations.
Well, I think Winona hit the nail right on the head with her explanation of what it's like in the U.S. People feel as though they have a gun to their head. It's not making the best choice for your people. It's making the best choice out of a slew of options that are going to really, undermine your people's rights. They're going to destroy the environment. They're going to impede people's health and safety. Or you have a roof over your head and food on your table, and you can, put clothes on the backs of your children. This is the reality: is our communities are put in economic hostage situations. As the number one employer in the region, our communities are forced into a corner to make really hard decisions. And I have a lot of relatives, family members that are employed by this industry that also support the opposition to the Trans Mountain Pipeline, that support the opposition to the continued expansion of the Alberta tar sands in our backyard. But when it comes down to leadership, our leadership has been coerced. Through bribery, through coercion by the government, coercion by the companies themselves to make deals. And what we're looking to do in this region, rather than look for the consent of Indigenous communities, is we're looking for what it's going to take monetarily to get communities to finally buckle under the pressure, the financial pressures that exist within our territories. So as far as the debate goes, it's really, really mixed. People don't know what to do anymore. They feel really locked into this economy, and they feel forced to make decisions that they don't necessarily agree with. And we're not really being given any other options. Like we're hearing about Line 3 in the region here, they're saying that we need these pipelines in order to make transportation of oil safer. It's one or the other, not a good decision for our communities to be making.
We want to thank you both for being with us. We're going to do part 2 and post online at democracynow.org. Ariel Deranger speaking to us from Alberta, Indigenous Climate Action, Winona LaDuke, Native American activist with Honor the Earth. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks so much for joining us.